Bruce Lee was Shattering when Golden Harvest, a studio, said he was a one-hit wonder, and then Bruce Lee, the dragon that broke the chains. The Golden Harvest office smelled of cigar smoke and arrogance. The executives, sitting in their leather chairs, exchanged condescending glances while Bruce Lee stood, his fists clenched, his muscles tense like violin strings about to snap. The head producer, a man with gold-rimmed glasses and a shark-like smile, crossed his arms on the mahogany desk. Enter the Dragon was a success, Bruce, but Western audiences still see you as an exotic phenomenon. A martial arts film is one thing, but a star? He laughed, a dry sound like dry leaves being stepped on. You're a one-hit wonder, Lee. A stroke of luck. Bruce didn't move. His eyes, dark as spilled paint, fixed on the producer with an intensity that made the man look away for a second. He knew what was behind those words: fear. Fear that a Chinese, a foreigner, could dominate Hollywood. Fear that the world would see that true strength did not come from those who had the money, but from those who had the will. You're afraid, said Bruce, his voice low but cutting like a blade. Afraid that I will prove you wrong. The producer snorted. Fear? We are Hollywood, Lee. We make the stars. Bruce smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was the smile of a man who had already seen the future and knew they were not part of it. Then show me the contract, he said. Or I'll leave. The bluff worked. Or at least, that's what they thought. They signed a deal for 2 more films, but the terms were a cage: tight budgets, impossible deadlines, scripts hastily rewritten by writers who knew nothing about martial arts. Bruce read every line, every fine print, and knew they were trying to sabotage him. But he also knew something they didn't: he didn't need them. The battle in the shadows. While Golden Harvest executives laughed behind the scenes, Bruce began building his own empire. He rented a warehouse in Kowloon, turning it into a makeshift dojo where he trained not just his body, but his mind. He studied philosophy, wrote scripts, recorded instructional tapes that he sold by mail order. Every move, every blow, was a declaration of war. His students, a mix of actors, wrestlers, and misfits, viewed him as a god. But Bruce knew that gods also bleed. One night, after an exhausting workout, he felt a sharp pain at the base of his skull. A migraine so intense it brought him to his knees. The doctor who examined him frowned. Stress, he said. And exhaustion. Your body is at its limit. Bruce laughed. My body is the limit. But the pain returned. And he came back. And he came back. The last round. The first film under the new contract was a disaster. Game of Death was supposed to be his masterpiece, but Golden Harvest cut the budget, changed the script and hired stuntmen who couldn't imitate his moves. The fight scenes looked like choreography from a B-movie. Bruce watched the final cut in silence, his fingers digging into the arms of his chair. That's not art, he said finally. That's a joke. The producer shrugged. It's what the public wants. No, Bruce stood up. It's what you want the public to want. He left the studio without looking back. He knew that this would be his last chance in Hollywood. But I also knew that Hollywood wasn't the world. The dragon flies alone. Bruce returned to Hong Kong. Not as an actor, but as a visionary. He founded his own production company, Concord Production Incorporated, and began filming Game of Death the way he wanted. No interference. No limits. The filming was brutal. He did all the fight scenes, refused stunt doubles, demanded perfection. The headache came back with more force, but he ignored it. One night, after shooting a 10-minute fight sequence non-stop, he passed out in his assistant's arms. Take me home, he murmured. At the hospital, doctors discovered swelling in the brain. An allergic reaction to a painkiller he had taken to cope with the pain. A cruel irony, the man who had survived 1,000 battles would be defeated by a pill. You need to rest, said the doctor. Months. Maybe years. Bruce smiled. I don't have months. He left the hospital the next day. The legend does not die. On July 20, 1973, Bruce Lee was found unconscious in his apartment. Doctors tried to revive him, but it was too late. The dragon was gone. The news spread like wildfire. In Hong Kong, thousands of people filled the streets for the funeral. In Hollywood, the same executives who had called him a one-hit wonder were now crying in interviews, calling him a genius. But Bruce didn't need his tears. He had already won. Game of Death was released posthumously, incomplete, but still became a classic. The scenes he had filmed, the ones that Golden Harvest had tried to ruin, were now studied by filmmakers and fighters. His legacy was not in the films he made, but in those he inspired. Years later, a young wrestler named Jackie Chan watched a worn-out copy of Enter the Dragon at a neighborhood movie theater. He came out of there with his eyes shining. I want to do this, he told a friend. I want to be like him. And so, the dragon continued flying. Dragon's legacy. The years passed, and the legend of Bruce Lee grew like an unquenchable flame. In Hong Kong, where it all began, a bronze statue was erected in his honor, with his fists raised in a fighting stance, as if he still challenged the world. Tourists took photos, but few understood the weight of that figure. For them, it was just another symbol of a culture they consumed without understanding. Jackie Chan, however, knew. He trained until his bones ached, repeating movements he had seen on screen, trying to capture the same burst of energy that Bruce possessed. But Hong Kong cinema was still dominated by tired formulas, and the studios saw him as just another pretty face. Until one day, while filming a mediocre project, he refused to do a dangerous scene without protection. Do you want to die like him? Shouted the director, exasperated. Jackie looked at the camera, at the loosely tied cables, at the concrete floor 10 feet away. And then, for the first time, he understood what Bruce had been trying to say all along. It wasn't about dying. It was about living. He walked off the set that day. I wouldn't go back to being a disposable stuntman. Meanwhile, in the United States, Bruce's widow, Linda Lee, was fighting a silent battle. Studios tried to profit from her husband's name, releasing unfinished projects and sensationalized interviews. She processed, negotiated, and, above all, protected. When a producer tried to sell the rights to an unauthorized biography full of lies, she took him on in court and won. He wasn't a product, she told a reporter years later. He was a man who believed in something bigger than himself. And it was true. Bruce hadn't just changed cinema. He had shown that an Asian could be more than a stereotype, that strength came not just from the muscles, but from the mind. In a world that still saw Orientals as exotic or submissive, he had been a hurricane. In 1993, almost 20 years after his death, a documentary called Dragon, the Bruce Lee story was released. The film, although romanticized, brought his story to a new generation. Among the spectators was a teenager named Jet Li, who watched the film in a packed Beijing cinema. When the lights came on, he didn't say anything. He just left, went home and trained until exhaustion. Years later, when he was already a star, Jet was asked what Bruce meant to him. He taught me that it doesn't matter where you come from, he said. What matters is where you go. Time passed, and the dragon continued flying. In Hong Kong, an old Wing Chun master, who had trained with Ip Man, watched a group of children practicing air kicks. One of them, a 10-year-old girl, threw a punch with precision that made him smile. Who taught you that? He asked. My father, she replied. He said he learned from a man who changed everything. The master nodded. He knew. Everyone knew. Bruce Lee had never really left. He was in every blow thrown with conviction, in every story told with passion, in every person who looked in the mirror and refused to be less than they could be. And so, as the sun set over Hong Kong harbor, the dragon's shadow stretched, long and untamed, over the world. The dragon doesn't die. Years had passed since the 10-year-old girl landed that precise punch. She grew up, and the world around her changed too. Hong Kong was no longer the same. Skyscrapers multiplied, the streets echoed with foreign languages, and the memory of Bruce Lee, once alive in the conversations of kung fu masters, began to dissolve like ink in water. But the dragon didn't go away. The girl, now a woman named Mei Ling, trained alone on the roof of an old building, where the wind carried the smell of the sea and the noise of night markets. She repeated the movements her father had taught her, the same ones he had learned from a man who had once said, "Don't have style. Be water." Mei Ling didn't know if she believed in ghosts, but she believed in what couldn't be seen, in the strength that came from within, in the anger that turned into discipline, in the fear that bent to courage. One day, a man appeared on the roof. He was neither a thief nor a police officer. He was older, with scars on his knuckles and eyes that looked like he had seen things that shouldn't be there. His name was Chen, and he said he was a student of one of IP Man's students. But Mei Ling knew it was a lie. There was something about his movements, the way he positioned himself, that reminded her of someone she only knew through stories. "You fight like him," Chen said bluntly. "Like who?" "Like the dragon." Mei Ling didn't respond. "I knew I didn't need it." Chen was not there by chance. There was an organization, a network of men who collected fighters as trophies, forcing them to battle in clandestine arenas where the rules were dictated by cruelty. They had heard about her, the girl who trained alone, who didn't belong to any school, who carried something in her fists that couldn't be taught. And they wanted to test it. "They're going to break you," Chen said. "Or they'll make you break the others." "And you?" Mei Ling asked, finally looking at him. "I've already been broken." "But not the dragon." The arena was in a damp basement, lit by lamps that flickered like tired eyes. There were men with snake tattoos, women with knives hidden in their boots, gamblers who screamed in languages Mei Ling didn't understand. In the center, an improvised ring, surrounded by rusty bars. His opponent was a giant, a Russian fighter with arms the size of his legs. He laughed when he saw her enter. "Is this a joke?" Mei Ling didn't smile. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the air in her lungs, the tension in her muscles. He remembered what his father had said, "When you fight, it's not you against someone else. It's you against fear. And fear always loses." The giant advanced. Mei Ling dodged the first blow with a fluid movement, as if dancing. He tried to grab her, but she was no longer there. His punches were fast, precise, as if each one carried a memory. The giant growled, frustrated, and charged forward with all his might. Mei Ling ducked, spun, and her foot connected with his temple with a sharp crack. The man fell like a felled tree. Silence took over the basement. The gamblers stopped shouting. Someone coughed. Then, Chen appeared beside her. "You win," he said. "But they won't let you leave." Mei Ling knew. They never left. The escape was chaotic. Armed men chased them through Kowloon's narrow streets, past food stalls and abandoned bicycles. Mei Ling ran without looking back, feeling the sweat running down her back, her heart beating like a war drum. Chen led the way, opening the way with punches and kicks that seemed impossible for a man his age. "Where are we going?" she shouted, as they turned a corner and almost collided with a group of tourists. "To the only place where they won't look for us," Chen replied, without slowing down. They came to a dead end, a forgotten place where trash accumulated and the walls were covered in graffiti. Chen pushed open a rusty metal door, revealing a dark corridor. At the end, a staircase descended into the bowels of the city. "What is that?" Mei Ling asked hesitantly. "A place where dragons still live." Down below, among abandoned tunnels and rooms that smelled of mold and incense, Mei Ling found others. There weren't many, a dozen, perhaps, but each one bore the same mark, the shadow of the dragon. There was an old man who taught children to fight with sticks, a woman who sewed boxing gloves from fish skin, a young man who wrote poems about the art of combat. Everyone had a story, and every story began with a man who said, "Don't be a slave to what others expect of you." Chen led her to a room where an antique mirror reflected only darkness. "Look," he said. Mei Ling looked. And then he saw it. It wasn't his reflection. It was him. Bruce Lee, young, smiling, as if to say, "You're still there. I knew you would be." She closed her eyes. When she opened them again, there was only herself. "What do we do now?" he asked. Chen smiled. "We fought." The following months were of training and preparation. Mei Ling learned that the real battle was not against the men who persecuted them, but against the world that wanted to turn them into something less. They were not criminals, nor heroes. They were just people who refused to be tamed. When the organization finally found them, it was not in an arena, but on the streets, under the pale light of a broken streetlight. This time, there were no gamblers, no rules. Just pure violence. Mei Ling fought alongside Chen and the others. There was no glorious victory, no humiliating defeat. There was only survival. And in the end, when the last of the attackers fell, when blood stained the asphalt and silence reigned again, Mei Ling realized that it didn't matter if they had won or not. What mattered was that the dragon was still flying. Years later, in a small kung fu studio in Vancouver, a 10-year-old girl threw a punch in the air with precision that made her master smile. "Who taught you that?" he asked. "My mother," she replied. "She said she learned from a man who changed everything." The master nodded. He knew. Everyone knew. And so, as the sun set over the city, the dragon's shadow stretched, long and untamed, over the world. Because some things never die. They just wait for the next person who refuses to be less than they can be. The dragon that never fell. The blood on the asphalt had already dried when Mei Ling knelt down next to the last attacker. He was still breathing, but his eyes, as glassy with pain, didn't recognize him. She felt no hatred, no relief, just an eerie stillness, as if time had stopped to give her a moment of clarity. The smell of gunpowder and sweat mingled with the damp night air, and for a moment, all she heard was the sound of her own breathing, slow and controlled. Then, the silence was broken by the sound of hurried footsteps. Voices in Mandarin and Cantonese echoed through the alleys, mixed with shouts in English. The police. She knew she couldn't stay. He stood up slowly, his sore muscles protesting, and looked at the fallen man one last time. There was nothing else to do there. Mei Ling disappeared before the red and blue lights illuminated the street. 3 years before. The Hong Kong dojo smelled of aged wood and old sweat. Mei Ling, then 25 years old, trained under the supervision of Master Lau, a man with hunched shoulders and razor-sharp eyes. He wasn't like other masters, he didn't just teach movements, but stories. And the story that was most repeated was that of a man called Li Wei, the last dragon. He wasn't invincible, said Master Lau, while correcting Mei Ling's posture. But he was relentless. When he fought, it wasn't for glory. It was because someone needed it. Mei Ling had never seen Li Wei fight. He had disappeared years before, after a war in the shadows that few understood. Some said he had died. Others, that he had gone into exile. But Master Lau always smiled when he talked about him, as if he was keeping a secret. "One day, you will understand," was all he said. And then, one stormy night, she understood. The night everything changed. The warehouse at the port was dark, lit only by hanging lamps that swayed in the wind. Mei Ling didn't want to be there. But when the man who had hired her, a smuggler named Chen, showed her the list of names, she had no choice. "They killed my brother," he said, his voice shaking. "And they'll kill more people if no one stops them." On the list, among drug dealers and corrupt politicians, there was a name that made his blood run cold, Victor Kwan. Victor Kwan was a ghost. A man who moved pieces in the underworld without ever appearing. And now, he was there, in the warehouse, surrounded by armed men. Mei Ling knew she couldn't face them alone. But he also knew he couldn't run away. It was then that she heard it. A low, almost imperceptible whistle, cutting through the noise of the rain. And then, a sound she knew from training, the shing of a blade being drawn. "You took your time," said a voice behind her. Mei Ling turned around and saw a tall man, his face marked by old scars. He wore a long coat, frayed at the edges, and his eyes, dark, almost black, shined with an intensity that she recognized at once. "Li Wei," she whispered. He smiled, but there was no joy in the gesture. "Don't call me that. That name died a long time ago." The warehouse battle. There were no words of encouragement. There were no plans drawn up. Li Wei simply walked forward, and Mei Ling followed. The first man fell before even drawing his gun. Li Wei moved like water, fluid and unpredictable, disarming one, breaking another's arm, while Mei Ling covered their back, using the opponent's strength against them. She wasn't as fast as him, nor as precise, but she had something that Li Wei no longer had: fury. Victor Quan tried to escape when he realized the situation was lost. Mei Ling caught up with him at the warehouse exit, knocking him down with a kick to the back. He rolled on the ground, his face contorted with fear, and raised his hands. "I'll pay," he shouted. "Double what Chen offered you." Mei Ling looked at him. There was no hatred in his eyes. Just a calculated coldness. "Money won't bring my brother back," she said. And then, with one swift movement, he broke his neck. The legacy. Li Wei disappeared that night. Some say he returned to the mountains. Others, who crossed the ocean. Mei Ling never saw him again. But before leaving, he left her two things: a false name and advice. "You're not a murderer," he said, as he adjusted the collar of his coat. "You are a survivor. And survivors don't look back." She followed the advice. He used the false name to leave Hong Kong, crossed the Pacific and settled in Vancouver. He opened a small kung fu studio, where he taught children how to defend themselves. It wasn't a glamorous life, but it was a life. And then, years later, the 10-year-old girl landed her punch in the air with a precision that made her master smile. "My mother," said the girl. "She said she learned from a man who changed everything." The master nodded. He knew. Everyone knew. Because some stories don't end. They transform. And the dragon, after all, never fell. He just found new wings.